This is a presentation on land value taxation. It's aimed at interested Labour Party members in general, and specifically as an aid to political education officers to help you formulate a presentation to your branch or constituency party. The accompanying slides can be downloaded from the Labour Land Campaign website if you want to use any of them to introduce the idea to your comrades, although you might be able to make prettier ones. Once upon a time, the Labour Party had a big idea: common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange. Whatever you think about the relevance of this idea, now that the hegemony of liberal democracy has brought about the end of history, the idea that big government is equivalent to inefficiency and the creation of a welfare-dependent underclass that lives off the back of aspirational strivers has taken hold, even amongst our own leadership. And because the Labour Party has been reticent about challenging some of these precepts, it's increasingly perceived by the electorate as Tory light. Tax the rich a couple of percent more, spend a bit more on public infrastructure, maybe regulate the finance industry a little more tightly, cap utility bills but don't nationalise the corresponding industries. The differences between the two main parties today are quantitative rather than qualitative. This is betraying democracy, with more disillusion with politics today than ever before, especially amongst the young. The Tories have their ideology, liberalism, with as little government intervention as is compatible with keeping riots off the streets. But it's difficult to say what the ideology of today's Labour Party is. No surprise the sentiment that you hear on every other doorstep: I'm not voting because they're all the same. This presentation's about a not-so-new big idea, land value taxation, and why it's a natural Labour Party policy. What is LVT? Well, let's start with, what's taxation? As we all know, taxes are the price we pay for a civilised society, but they're more than just that. Fiscal policy is a powerful instrument for social engineering, and all states down the ages have used it as such. You can formulate taxes to promote social homogeneity and economic productivity, or you can choose to cater to a certain limited constituency. Examination of our current fiscal system suggests that down the ages the latter has been the priority. Perhaps not surprising when one considers the history of the governance of the United Kingdom. Let's not forget that property owning restrictions on suffrage were finally abolished less than 100 years ago. British fiscal policy was drawn up by landowners. So what makes a good tax? Obviously, Labour Party principles dictate that an ideal tax would be fair and progressive in that those most able to pay should pay most. An instrument to redistribute income and promote social cohesion. Whatever your politics, any good tax would be easy and therefore cheap to collect, and closely related to that, an ideal tax would be difficult to avoid, however many corporate lawyers are on the job. But perhaps most importantly, it should be efficient in the economist's sense. Any tax that falls on workers, production or trade will dampen and distort economic activity, what the UK Treasury calls their dead weight loss. But a more economically efficient one will do this less. The phrase tax efficiency has been sinisterly distorted in modern tax-dodging industry newspeak, but it has a real meaning for economists: productive activity and economic growth. If income tax plus national insurance contributions amounted to 100% of our wages, not many people would bother working. If it were at 40%, more might. Let's hope so, because that's what it is today in Britain. The higher the tax on labour, the less labour will get done. Rule number 1 of taxation: the more you tax it, the lower the incentive to do it. That's why we tax smoking and drinking so heavily. Some examples. Income tax and national insurance are fairly easy to collect, at least for salaried employees. Nor can employees with a payslip easily avoid them, although we all know about those with higher incomes and a skyscraper full of accountants. And one can't help wondering whether a system as Byzantine as employers' national insurance contributions wasn't formulated by the kind of people that after a few years in the civil service get high-paying jobs in those self-same skyscrapers. For this presentation, I tried to understand how the employer's national insurance contribution system works, but it's horrifically complicated and horrendously boring. I gave up. Similarly, one can argue about how fair income tax and national insurance contributions are, but one thing is sure: both of these taxes fail the economic efficiency test big time, and together they account for £250 billion a year, nearly 50% of Treasury revenue. The more you tax labour, the less incentive there is to work. And ironically, the Party of Labour has been more, if anything, avidly enthusiastic about taxing labour rather than wealth than has been the Party of Wealth. Here's a good one. It's in the name. Why on earth would you want to tax value added? That's what you want, isn't it? Taxing it makes goods and services more expensive, thereby depressing demand and destroying jobs, as well as it being a tax that unfairly penalises low-income consumers. Not only that, but it's difficult to collect and easy to avoid. In fact, it's even so easy to defraud that billions every year are actually stolen from the Treasury. Some taxes are just idiotic and vicious. But all our current taxes have their disadvantages. My black marks are fairly arbitrary, but you can figure out your own. Even excise duties on petroleum, tobacco and alcohol, instruments of social engineering designed to discourage things society doesn't want, like pollution, smoking and drinking, even these tend to hit the poor hardest. And while a property tax like a mansion tax would fairly target the richest, it would also tend to discourage improvement of existing property and is therefore economically inefficient. In fact, I don't think that anyone would claim that any of our current main taxes are both fair and economically efficient. Who said this? Land is the mother of monopolies, etc., and unearned profit from it is detrimental to society. And this: the Conservative Party speaks of the profit from land as if it were the fruits of thrift and industry, and a pleasing example for the poor to imitate. That was before he went back to the cosy fold. And yet, land itself has never been taxed in Britain, and not very often anywhere else. No prizes for guessing who writes the fiscal Bible the world over. So how do you tax the ultimate monopoly and recover the unearned profit derived from it? A land value tax is an annual levy on the unimproved value of land, ignoring any buildings or amenities added to it by the landowner's work and investment, past and present. The purpose is to capture a share of the value of land for the public purse. This share would notably include any increased land value, which is rarely much to do with the owner's industry and investment and is therefore unearned income. In terms of land value, a derelict plot is worth as much as the adjoining plot with a block of 100 luxury flats on it, as long as both have the same permitted use, i.e., the derelict plot has or would get planning permission for a block of 100 luxury flats. Their value is the same because the two parcels of land are in the same place with the same access to local amenities and services. The proportion of the price of a property that corresponds to the value of the land that comes with it will depend on particulars of the property and geographical location, but land value will, as a rule, be a major part. My granddad bought a house in London in 1910 for 100 guineas. Now it's worth £2 million. Sure enough, my family's painted it a couple of times, and they even put in an inside toilet. But that didn't all cost £2 million, less 100 guineas adjusted for inflation. I don't like to think that my family's speculators, but we have nevertheless profited from possessing an asset without doing very much at all to enhance its value ourselves. Almost the entire increment has been in the value of the land. Economists call such unearned benefits economic rent, which, in the case of land, the ultimate fixed supply asset, essentially accrues from public sector investment. Thus, rather than being a tax, This is more like asking landowners for a payment for benefits received, a share of the unearned income they get from their asset without having had to do anything. If the Duke of Westminster enhances the value of one of his properties by building an Olympic swimming pool in the garden, it might seem different from the increase in the property's value because Westminster Council built an Olympic swimming pool down the road. But without LVT, it comes to much the same. A quick example to illustrate the point. When the Jubilee Underground line was extended in the 1990s, it cost £3.5 billion of public money. In a 2-year period, around the opening of the line in 1999, an independent assessment was conducted of the increase in land value around one of the stations, Canary Wharf. Within 500 metres of the station, the overall increase in land value specifically attributable to the extension project amounted to £2 billion. All this land is now owned by the China Investment Corporation, a sovereign wealth fund. A conservative estimate for the overall rise around all 11 stations over the same 2-year time frame is £13.5 billion. This return of nearly 200% a year on a public sector investment all went into private pockets. Public sector taxpayer funded investment is what makes society civilized, what makes for good places to live, work and raise a family. Not just tube trains, but also buses, hospitals, schools, sewerage systems, parks, rubbish collection, policemen, fire engines, the BBC, etc., etc. And all those are what makes land in London and Britain so valuable. So, taxing land value makes logical sense. It's the public sector recovering a share of the return on its own investment. But is it a good tax in other ways? Well, is it easy to collect? It's easier to collect than property taxes like council tax or mansion tax because it ignores the vagaries of assessing millions of unique properties. Vagaries that are partially responsible for the fact that council tax bands in England haven't been reviewed in over 20 years, a grossly unfair situation that tends to prejudice the less well-off. Someone in a house that was worth £1 million in 1991 only pays twice as much as someone whose house was then worth £70,000. Land value is a function of the area of the parcel of land, its location, notably its proximity to amenities, and its actual or potential permitted use. In effect, local planning regulations. Every parcel along a typical terrace street will have more or less the same land value. Effective computer-aided mass assessment techniques are available off the shelf for use with geographical information systems, so land value can largely be assessed without ever leaving the office. This means that revaluation can be quasi-automatic and more or less as regular as you want. Payment could be direct, like council tax, or possibly associated with other existing collection mechanisms like PAYE or self-assessment. Is it difficult to avoid? Well, you can't put your mansion or Scottish shooting estate in the Cayman Islands, and if it is owned by a company domiciled in the Cayman Islands, as extraordinarily so much of this green and pleasant land is, who cares? You know where to collect the tax due, and if no one pays up, you know what to expropriate. Despite a general perception that wealth is less land-based than it used to be, that's not the case. Although less land might be in the hands of Lord Downton Abbey, capital, excluding land and housing, has been roughly constant as a share of the economy since the mid-1950s, and it's lower today than at the turn of the 20th century. The main thing that's skyrocketed over the past several decades is the value of land and therefore the price of housing, largely because of the massive input of money poured into it in the form of debt to banks. The total value of the housing stock in the UK was £1.3 trillion in 1990. With only inflation, that would now be worth £2 trillion. But its actual value is well over £4 trillion. This doubling of wealth has come through a rise in the value of land itself, not through new buildings, because notoriously not many houses were built in that time frame. and that rate of return vastly outweighs returns from the productive economy. So taxing land will be a tax on wealth. The greatest levy will fall on the very wealthiest in society. So that makes it fair in the way that income tax is fair. Rich people will pay more towards maintaining civilized society. But LVT is also fair in the sense that rather than being a tax, it's a payment for unearned benefits. So LVT is doubly fair. Not only does it mean that those who are most able to pay are the ones who pay the most, but also that those that benefit the most from public sector investment contribute the most towards it in a logical and proportionate measure, which for many and various reasons is far from the current case. More important than fairness in some minds, land value taxation is economically efficient. Unlike income tax, it doesn't inhibit work and labour. Unlike sales tax, it doesn't discourage economic activity, and unlike corporation tax and business rates, it doesn't penalise enterprise and investment. I put this one in for the minority who might understand it. Apparently, it shows that taxing a commodity, the supply of which is inelastic or strictly fixed, doesn't deter production, distort market mechanisms, or otherwise cause loss of economic efficiency. There you go. What might be clearer to those like me who struggle with this kind of thing is that when supply of a good is fixed, as it is in the case of land, any tax levied on that commodity will be entirely borne by its owner. In the chart, the fixed supply of land is represented by the vertical line on the quantity axis. The demand curve doesn't shift as a result of the tax. The price, in this case the rent that tenants are prepared to pay, is determined by market forces and remains unchanged. So the effect of the tax is to transfer to the public purse part of the surplus profit or rent, in the economic sense, previously extracted exclusively by the owner. In the chart, this is represented by tax revenue replacing part of the producer surplus. To sum up, LVT won't cause rent increases. In the current situation, it's actually tenants who pay a kind of tax when the value of the land they rent increases. That's why your rent goes up when Transport for London builds a tube station down the road. It's just that it's the landlord who's pocketing that tax rather than the Treasury. All this makes kind of common sense because we all know that any landlord will just get as much as he possibly can in rent without regard to how much he has to lay out. The rent on a mortgaged buy-to-let house is the same as that on the house next door whose owner finished paying for it 20 years ago. It's all market forces. In fact, this is actually something of a simplification, but what can you expect from economists? In fact, rents would rise because LVT would impact on both demand and supply and therefore chew this lovely theoretical graph right up. Nevertheless, for tenants, this would be more than compensated by the fact that if council tax were abolished, more of the onus of taxation would fall on the landlord. So, there are economic as well as social and practical reasons for LVT. Many economists across the spectrum of political thought have advocated it. Adam Smith, Thomas Paine, David Ricardo, Henry George, the name most intimately associated with LVT, and more recently Joseph Stiglitz and Martin Wolf, amongst many others. And that loony lefty Milton Friedman described taxing land value as the least bad tax. So, land value taxation is relatively easy and cheap to collect, and it's impossible to dodge. Most importantly, for a socialist party, it's a fair tax, and for a party that aspires to responsible government and economic credibility, it's the most economically efficient form of taxation there is. As an article in The Economist about LVT this year said, politically tricky problems are 10 a penny. Few offer the people who solve them $1 trillion reward. The Economist emphasises that it's a politically tricky problem. There will be those again it. First, there are the great landowners whose class has spent 1,000 years engineering society, and in particular its fiscal policy, to their own benefit, and this lot still wield obscene power. But more importantly for the Labour Party are the working and middle class householders with all their wealth in this single asset who'll feel threatened, not least because of the barrage of hysteria and misinformation that'll be unleashed by the Tory press. For example, a big chunk of Wiltshire belongs to non-dom Viscount Rothermere, who enterprisingly inherited the Daily Mail, although said land is patriotically owned for tax purposes by a company based in the British Virgin Islands. The discourse will therefore have to get it over that LVT will be a replacement tax, not an add-on, and it will be up to the wonks to figure out exactly how to ensure that there'll be more winners than losers. That shouldn't be too difficult. A minority of people will be paying significantly more than they pay under the current system, not least because LVT can't be dodged. For the sake of argument, let's take a non-random figure, 1%, but don't hold me to it. So, if LVT is used to replace less fair taxes, essentially any of them, on a revenue neutral basis, simple maths shows that everyone else, which even though it might not be 99%, will necessarily be the majority of people because wealth is so highly concentrated in this country, most will be paying less. Moreover, the tax base would immediately expand because on the one hand LVT is difficult to dodge, and on the other hand the owners of unexploited land would be paying LVT instead of nothing at all. But of course, when it comes to who wins and who loses, the devil's in the detail. For implementation, the first practical question is, what taxes should LVT replace? And this decision will condition the level of LVT that needs to be set to bring in the same amount of revenue as will be lost by abolishing worse taxes. Hardline LVTers see it as a single tax, replacing all other taxes. And the most libertarian among them would also see it as funding a citizen's income, a cash dividend for every single person in the country to replace the welfare system. Whatever your position on the desirability of such a radical overturning of the established social order, that option's probably not for tomorrow. One possibility would be to replace income tax and or national insurance contributions. One of the advantages of this would be that the LVT levy could be phased in gradually in parallel to incremental rises in the threshold for the payment of income tax, each step on a revenue neutral basis. As time went by, fewer and fewer people would be paying any income tax or national insurance, and ultimately these two taxes could be abolished altogether. However, income tax is a redistributive tax, despite this being seriously compromised by avoidance and evasion by the highest earners, but it's by no means the worst tax on the books. Another possibility that might be more politically attractive would be to start by replacing business rates with a LVT levied on all commercial land, including rented properties, but exempting owner-occupiers. But business rates only accounts for some 5% of overall tax revenue, and replacing them wouldn't raise consciousness about LVT in the population as a whole. While the most unfair and economically inefficient taxes should definitely be on the horizon, the most practical initial option might be to start by getting rid of both council tax and business rates, which together account for about £50 billion of revenue, or 10% of overall Treasury take. To compensate for £50 billion of shortfall, LVT could be set initially at an average annual concessionary rate of 0.85% on owner-occupied properties and a full rate of 3% on commercial properties, including rented properties, second homes and agricultural land. This embodies a distinction between land held for consumption, i.e. living on, and land which is held in order to yield an income. Of course, those who derive income from their land, notably landlords and farmers, could offset their LVT levies against what they pay in corporation tax or personal income tax, so it would in part be a replacement tax for them as well. This hypothesis has been analysed and costed in detail by the Labour Land Campaign, from whose website you can download a detailed breakdown of figures and timescales. Without going into too much detail now, these figures are based on the total value of all land in the UK being about £7 trillion, with residential property accounting for about 70% of that. It's estimated that preparation for implementation could be completed within 2 years. Tweaks may be politically expedient. In some areas like London, where land values have risen excessively, 0.85% of capital value may come out far higher than what the household is currently paying in council tax. This could be mitigated by each local authority setting its own level of LVT to collect the same amount as they currently collect in council tax from owner-occupied homes. In other words, initially, the rate of LVT would be different for each local authority, with the 0.85% figure merely representing the average across the country. Other tweaks may be necessary to prevent serious hardship and unfairness in specific populations, like the poor widow in her big old family home. In fact, there may be fewer asset-rich, cash-poor cases than one thinks. After all, most people who live in big houses have sources of income. And in any case, there could be a system for deferring levies until the house is sold. In the longer term, perhaps over 10 to 20 years, with valuation and collection systems in place and the principle of LVT part of the national psyche, the concessionary rate of 0.05% could be gradually stepped up to the full rate of 3% as other taxes are abolished. The next target might be the idiotic VAT. An extreme scenario to illustrate the point: if all other taxes were replaced, compensating for the shortfall of $600 billion a year, i.e. total current Treasury revenue, would mean setting LVT at 8 to 9%. That would mean that a household living in the average UK property worth about $200,000, of which the land value is $110,000, that household would pay about £9,000 a year. This may or may not sound like a lot compared with what you might be aware of paying out in income tax, national insurance contributions, council tax, stamp duty, inheritance tax and VAT, but we also pay many stealth taxes. You don't get bills for corporation tax, business rates, Section 106 agreements, or even other people's income tax. But you pay them whenever you buy anything or rent a home. When you buy a new car, the taxes you know that you're paying to the government are VAT and vehicle excise duty. But you're also paying the income tax and national insurance contributions of the workers and managers that made the car, on top of the raft of other corporate taxes that the car company has to pay. The average household earning £50,000 a year pays out about 50% of that income to the government in the most important visible taxes. They'll also be paying one-off direct taxes and the less visible taxes. Totting these up is less easy, but together they account for fully 25% of Treasury revenue, so chances are something between 70 and 80% of what you earn ultimately goes to the government if you're on an average wage. So a level of LVT that sounds frightening at first will probably be less than you're currently handing over to the government unless you're very rich. LVT would increase the real disposable income of most households. For me personally, LVT would probably come to more than I pay now. My household has a single average income, and we live in a house in London where land values are particularly, one might say obscenely, high. Although even I might be breaking even if they abolish alcohol and tobacco duties. However you implement LVT, it would, in addition to bringing revenue into the Treasury on a fair, easy to administer basis, have corollary benefits. A brief run-through of some of these. First, an essential component in the housing crisis is under-exploitation of constructible land, so-called brownfield sites. On the one hand, because it doesn't cost anything to leave land that you own derelict, and on the other, because the apparently unstoppable steep rise in land value in many places encourages speculative land banking, i.e. the accumulation of undeveloped land to sell on to investors, a practice that's often fraudulent but nevertheless puts much potentially useful land out of commission. LVT would abolish speculation in land. There'd be no sense in leaving potentially useful land, meaning land that could be used to generate income. There'd be no sense in leaving such land unexploited with a view to a higher return in the future, since any rise in land value, and more, would be captured by the state. The Tories are pressing hard to relax planning regulations in the Green Belt. Totally unnecessary. The pernicious effects of rising land value means that there's more than enough constructible land lying unexploited in places where people would love to live. Taxing rising land values would therefore protect the Green Belt and also work against urban sprawl. LVT is a tax even with a green component, which may be one reason why it's part of Green Party policy. Second, the present system actually prejudices against development and improvement. If a landowner enhances his property, he'll have to pay more council tax and more tax on his rental income. If a businesswoman invests in her premises to enhance production or improve working conditions, she'll have to pay higher business rates and more corporation tax, whether or not she owns or rents the premises. In contrast, LVT encourages investment by landowners and entrepreneurs to ensure that their asset is put to optimum use and yields as much income as it possibly can. In different places, this would translate as more housing, more jobs, better services, or environmental improvement. Third, LVT will favour the regeneration of disadvantaged areas where land value is low. Currently, marginal costs to businesses in depressed areas are high because they pay the same rates of corporation tax, income tax, and employers' national insurance contributions. If these taxes were replaced by LVT, a manufacturer or service provider anxious to cut down overheads would set up on a site with low land value to minimise its tax bill. If you're a house builder, the incentive will be to construct on low value land where local amenities and services are currently poor. With more jobs in the vicinity and a growing population, local land values will start rising in time, providing revenue to improve infrastructure and services. And even in our most fortunate towns, the urban landscape is blighted by unsightly parcels of derelict land and depressingly empty shops, office buildings and houses. These are largely the result of speculation. With land value rising in sought-after areas, far better to do nothing and wait to develop the asset or sell it on, and that would be prevented by LVT. A minor corollary to this is NIMBYism. If they're going to build a nuclear power station in your garden, the value of your land will drop off a cliff. It might sweeten the pill somewhat if your tax bill goes off the same cliff. That's a silly example, but you get what I mean when it comes to objections to vital public infrastructure projects. 4. LVT will lower property prices. This for two reasons. On the one hand, because the LVT that a buyer will have to pay in the future will directly affect the current market price, and on the other hand, because following implementation, the release of underutilised land onto the market will increase supply. The only real people genuinely affected adversely by falling house prices are property owners who wish to downsize or sell up altogether without buying a new house. And that's a relatively small number of people, especially in these neo-feudal times when the only possibility of acquiring property for most young people is to inherit it. So lower property prices would make house ownership possible for a whole new group of people, and it might not be inaccurate to say for a whole new generation. Similarly, lower prices on business properties would free up more money for wages and useful investment in productivity enhancing resources. The big losers would be the banks. 85% of bank lending activity is in the residential housing market, and in practice, it's the banks that recover most of the increased land value lost to the Treasury when they collect interest from mortgagees paying ever-rising house prices. In effect, captured land value has been the major part of the supernormal profits that semi-monopolist banks have enjoyed in recent times. Whether or not you personally will benefit from lower house prices, which as a rule depends on your place on or off the famous property ladder, the drop may in time be compensated by increasing economic activity at both local and national levels. Locally, as a direct effect of the introduction of LVT, as mentioned a moment ago, and nationally, because brakes on economic development will be reduced as other economically inefficient taxes are phased out. Even if you think that lower property prices are a disadvantage of LVT rather than a corollary benefit, you have to admit that land value rising because of a more vibrant economic activity and improved local amenities and services is healthier than a rise driven by a speculative bubble. Economic efficiency is a close cousin of productivity, which in turn is a big part of competitiveness. More specifically, a big part of the price of any manufactured product or service is tax and associated charges. An important reason why American cars are less competitively priced than Japanese cars is the terrible inefficiency of the private American health insurance system, with workers' health insurance adding over $1,500 to the price of every General Motors car. Products from a country with economically inefficient taxes will cost more than products from a country with a more efficient taxation system, even if both those states are collecting the same overall revenue. So if these two states are competing at the international level, the one with a tax system that doesn't fall on workers, production or trade will be at an advantage. LVT could enhance Britain's economic competitiveness and favourably influence its balance of payments, both areas in which the United Kingdom performs particularly poorly on the international stage. Other collateral benefits are many and various. For example, having an unavoidable tax might free up some of the brightest and best in the tax dodging industry for more productive input into the labour market. Or taxing agricultural land might counter the current incentive enjoyed by landowners who keep vast tracts fallow in order to pick up subsidies. It might encourage them to sell up to young would-be farmers who will put the land to better use, grow things. And maybe even the kudos that would derive from Britain implementing a tax system that favours the majority of its citizens rather than a small elite. A lesson that's relevant almost everywhere, because almost everywhere fiscal systems have been established by the same class. So this is by no means an exhaustive list, but broadly speaking, in any aspect in which an advantage will accrue from making land use more efficient or labour and investment more lucrative, be it housing, farming or industry, LVT will bring about corollary benefits. If the profit from public sector investment were harvested for more public sector investment instead of going into private hands, a virtuous cycle could be established in which state spending drives increasing land value, as it has always done, which is in turn harvested to fund further public sector investment to improve the quality of life of citizens. A sustainable, positive feedback system that would be played out at both the local and national levels. This public sector investment might be in tube trains, schools, teachers' wages, hospitals, nurses' wages, parks, libraries, free interpretative dance classes. Exactly what would be up to our elected officials. This is the opposite of the kind of vicious cycle that economically inefficient taxes like income tax, business rates, VAT and corporation tax establish, in which the taxation of productive activity suppresses demand, leading to less economic activity and decreased revenue to the Treasury, and in consequence lower public sector investment, less production, fewer jobs and lower quality of life. If we look at LVT as a sensible way of funding public investment, it's kind of a left-wing idea. And although it's definitely not nationalisation of the land, it does entail a recognition that land, even when privately owned, is a common good in which every one of a country's citizens has a stake. but it's also very much market driven, entirely dependent on market forces. In other words, the concept itself is neither left wing nor right wing. It's just a form of taxation that's easy to collect, difficult to avoid, doubly fair, and economically efficient. Left wing, right wing is essentially about how much taxes you raise and how you choose to spend them. But LVT, in and of itself, doesn't address that. It's just about how you raise the taxes that everyone, Tories and even teabaggers included, everyone agree are the price we pay for a civilised society. So would our Prime Minister, who's all about organising the fiscal system to reward hard work, would he agree with Winston Churchill and advocate taxing this particularly pernicious form of unearned income? Of course not, because the constituency to which he's most beholden is the wealthy, and in particular the landowning class. But that's not a question of ideology, it's just one of having to cater to a vested interest. Presumably even David Cameron, all things being equal, would prefer a fairer, more economically efficient fiscal system over the mess we have now. The reason why LVT is a natural policy for a socialist democratic party operating in a mixed capitalist liberal framework is because it's fairer and more economically efficient than any other form of taxation. The tactical reason why, for a political party that doesn't have to appease a powerful internal vested interest, why it's sensible to advocate a form of taxation that's patently better in every way than the current system, is that the other party will never be able to do it. LVT would be a vote winner if it were formulated and put to the electorate in the right way. In 1945, the Labour Party managed to sell a very big radical idea in the teeth of more or less the same vested interests. Let's hope we don't need another crisis to start talking about doing the right thing. And if it does take another crisis, let's hope it's just another financial crash rather than a world war. But in any case, we need to admit that we wasted one good crisis 7 years ago. So if that's what it takes, let's be ready with a big new idea for the next time. I hope this has given you the bare bones of what is a fairly complicated subject. For example, I haven't had time to review experiences of LVT where it has been implemented in the past, or where it is in operation now, nor have I been able to go very deeply into figures. But if you're interested, you can find all that on the Labour Land Campaign website. I encourage you to have a look. Thank you, and I'm sorry that I can't say